So, in my previous two blogs about performance gaps and training needs analysis and what they are, I talked about those things as two separate entities. And what I want to do now is just to show you how those two concepts work, if you like, in a pragmatic way in a workplace context. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use a simple flowchart diagram to illustrate how this whole process starts. So let's begin by assuming that you receive an inquiry, and the inquiry is internal or external, and the client is requesting training or development of one sort or another. What we do not do is just immediately start trying to identify training needs. In other words, what are the knowledge and skill requirements of the particular task, function or role they want the training in. The first question we have to ask leads us to this. We have to define the performance gap. In other words, what is the shortfall between what the target group is currently doing and what we expect or hope or intend that they should be doing. Now, if we can determine that there is a performance gap, we can go on to the next stage. But if we can't determine there's a performance gap, we've really got to question, well, what are we training? What is it we are trying to impact on? However, this leads us to this next step. And the next step is the reason for the performance gap understood? So we're defining where there is a shortfall between what the person or the group currently does and what they need to do. And now what we've got to define is the reason for the performance gap understood? Why is there this shortfall? Now, is the reason for the performance gap understood? If the answer is yes, then that leads us to a second question. And the second question is the performance gap due to missing knowledge or skills? So, is the reason for the performance gap understood? If the answer is yes, is it because of a missing knowledge or skill? Now, if we don't know the reason, in other words, we are not clear about why the performance gap, then obviously the next thing we have to do is to determine what is causing the performance gap. And it might be to do with something, context or equipment or problems in terms of where the person is working. But we have to determine what is causing the performance gap. Now, once we've done that, once we've determined the performance gap, then obviously that leads us back to this question. Is the performance gap due to missing knowledge or skill? The question then is very simple. If the answer is yes, it is, the performance gap is because the person doesn't know, or the persons don't know what to do, or they haven't got the requisite skills, so in other words, yes, it is, then in those circumstances, you would then go on to do a much more detailed needs analysis. Bore down into it, find out what the tasks are, find out what are the knowledge requirements, what are the skill requirements, and clearly you would take it from there in terms of training design. But if the answer is the performance gap due to missing knowledge and skills? It isn't. In other words, the answer is no. Then that most definitely is not a training need. And what you might do is suggest an alternative strategy, or just inform the individuals that it's not something that training can address. It may be something else. And in the previous videos we looked at the case being something to do with resourcing, or it could be something to do with a management function that's failing. But if you take a look at this entire flowchart diagram, it will lead you through the appropriate steps. So, client makes a request for training. The first thing we do is their performance gap. Is there a shortfall between what they're doing now and what they need to do? Is the reason for that performance gap understood? If the answer is no, we've got to find out. If the answer is yes, the question is the performance gap due to missing knowledge or skill? If it is missing knowledge or skill, then fine. Go on to do a much more detailed needs analysis. Get down into the detail of the knowledge and skill element. In other words, the content of the development or learning that's required. If the answer is no, it is not an absence of knowledge or skill, then really it's an alternative strategy that needs to be used in order to address the performance gap.